Have you ever had something taken from you by someone who believed they deserved it more than you did? Someone whose sense of entitlement was so profound they couldn't see the violation through their own righteousness? Before we dive into Emily's battle to reclaim what's rightfully hers, take a second to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Your support helps us bring more stories of everyday heroes standing their ground against the Marcus Bennetts of the world. Drop a comment about an heirloom that means the world to you. We read every single one and might feature your story next. The sapphire caught the morning light, sending blue fire dancing across Emily Jackson's bedroom wall. She twisted the gold band on her finger, a ritual performed countless times over the 15 years she'd worn her grandmother's ring. Through her divorce, the grueling climb up Boston's financial sector, and now, finally, home ownership in one of Massachusetts' most prestigious neighborhoods, the ring had been her talisman, her connection to Beatrice Jackson's unflinching resilience. "When the world pushes, you plant your feet," Grandma Beatrice used to say, Chicago accent thick and eyes sharp with the wisdom of someone who had survived the Depression, enviable poverty, and the casual racism of mid-century America. No one can move you unless you let them. From her bedroom window, Emily surveyed her new domain, a quarter-acre slice of Oak Ridge with a craftsman-style home that had cost her every bonus and promotion she'd fought for since business school. The sprawling oak in her backyard had witnessed the Revolutionary War, according to the realtor. Emily liked that, the idea of roots running deeper than anyone's living memory, of history that couldn't be erased. What she hadn't counted on was Marcus Bennett. He appeared precisely at 10 a.m. on her first Saturday in the house, crossing her freshly mowed lawn, the casual entitlement of someone who had walked that path countless times before. Tall, silver-haired, with a posture that suggested military background or old money, possibly both. His smile was practiced, reaching his mouth, but not his eyes, which remained cold and evaluative as they swept over her. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," he announced, extending a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Emily's first car. "Chateau Margaux, 2009. A good year." Emily accepted it with appropriate appreciation, though her internal alarms were already sounding. 15 years in corporate finance had taught her to recognize power plays disguised as courtesy. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Marcus Bennett." He said it as if it should mean something to her. "My family has been in Oak Ridge since its founding in 1796. That's our family home." He gestured to the immaculately maintained colonial next door, its brass placard announcing it as a historical landmark. "And you are?" "Emily Jackson." She deliberately offered no additional information, watching as he waited for elaborations that didn't come. Marcus filled the silence with a practiced chuckle. "The Simmons family owned this place for 40 years. Leonard was a dear friend. A heart attack took him rather suddenly last year." His eyes slid past her to the entryway, cataloging the modern furniture and sleek technology that had replaced the Simmons' traditional decor. Something tightened around his mouth. They had exquisite taste, very appropriate to the home's historical character. Emily recognized the subtle criticism. "I'm going for a different aesthetic." "Indeed." His smile remained fixed. "Leonard always consulted me before making any changes to the property. We shared an appreciation for maintaining Oak Ridge's unique heritage." The way he said heritage, like it was a living thing he personally guarded, sent a chill down Emily's spine. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied neutrally, making it clear she'd made no such commitment. Marcus nodded as if she'd agreed with him. The previous owners understood the communal nature of historic neighborhoods like ours. We tend to view ourselves as stewards rather than owners, temporary custodians of Oak Ridge's legacy. Temporary. The word hung between them. "I see you've kept Eleanor's garden," Marcus continued, gesturing toward the meticulously maintained flower beds along their shared property line. I've been tending those peonies for a decade now. They were her pride and joy. They're beautiful, Emily acknowledged, but they're on my property now, so I'll be taking care of them. For a fraction of a second, Marcus's mask slipped. A flash of something cold and possessive crossed his features before the benevolent neighbor persona returned. Of course, he said smoothly, though they require quite specific care. Perhaps I could show you my technique sometime. He glanced at his watch, a vintage Rolex that complemented his carefully cultivated image of old-world sophistication. I should let you get back to settling in. We must have you over for dinner soon. Introduce you to the right people in town. As he turned to leave, his gaze dropped to Emily's left hand, where her grandmother's sapphire ring caught the morning light. Interesting piece, he remarked, his tone casual, but his eyes suddenly sharp. Sapphires have a rich history in Oak Ridge. The Bennett women traditionally wore them. My mother's collection is now in the Historical Society's permanent display. Emily's fingers instinctively curled, protecting the ring from his invasive stare. This was my grandmother's, from Chicago. He studied it a moment longer, then nodded. Well, welcome to Oak Ridge, Ms. Jackson. I'm sure you'll find your place here. Eventually. As Marcus crossed back to his own property, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just experienced her first border skirmish in what might become a protracted war. What she couldn't have known then was how quickly the battle lines would be drawn, and that her grandmother's ring would soon become its central prize. The invasion began subtly. First came the tree service that arrived unannounced one Tuesday morning, truck idling loudly in Emily's driveway as workers prepared to trim the dangerous branches hanging over the property line, a service Marcus had generously arranged because he knew Emily was busy with her career. Next, a landscaping crew appeared to apply fertilizer to Eleanor's peonies, explaining that Dr. Bennett has been overseeing this garden for years, and they were just following the usual schedule. Each intrusion came with a plausible explanation, a reference to historical precedent, or an invocation of community standards that Emily, as a newcomer, couldn't possibly understand. When Emily installed a modern security light after a series of car break-ins in the neighborhood, an official letter from the Historical Preservation Committee appeared in her mailbox the very next day. The committee, chaired by none other than Marcus Bennett, expressed grave concerns about non-period appropriate modifications to her home's exterior. 3 weeks into her residency, Emily arrived home from work to find Marcus himself in her backyard, kneeling beside Eleanor's peonies with gardening shears and a wicker basket half filled with cut flowers. "What are you doing on my property?" Emily demanded, letting the garden gate slam behind her. Marcus looked up, not remotely embarrassed at being caught trespassing. "Just maintaining the cutting schedule. Eleanor always harvested the first blooms in early June, keeps the plants producing all summer." He gestured to the basket. "I'm donating these to the Historical Society's Founders' Day celebration, as always." "As always," Emily repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "Except that these are my flowers now, and you're on my property without permission." Marcus straightened, brushing soil from his knees with the casual confidence of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. "Perhaps I should have mentioned, the Simmons and I had an understanding about these gardens. They're historically significant plantings, you see. Some of these peonies are from original rootstock dating back to 1890. "I don't care if they were planted by George Washington himself," Emily replied evenly. "They're on my property, and you need permission to be here." Something cold flickered behind Marcus's eyes, a glimpse of the steel beneath the tweed. Later, Emily would understand that this moment, this first direct challenge to his authority, had marked her as a threat in Marcus's carefully ordered worldview. "You know," he said conversationally, placing another cutting in his basket, "Oak Ridge can be a challenging place for newcomers. Those who understand our traditions tend to integrate more smoothly. Those who don't, he shrugged eloquently. Well, they typically don't stay long. It wasn't quite a threat. Marcus Bennett would never be so crass as to make explicit threats. But the message was unmistakable: conform or be ostracized. Emily had faced down enough boardroom bullies to recognize the strategy. Create social consequences for resistance. Establish dominance through small violations that make direct confrontation seem petty or unreasonable. "Let me be clear," she said, stepping closer. "You are trespassing. Take your basket and leave. If you enter my property again without explicit invitation, I will call the police." Marcus's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened to flints. "The chief is an old friend. We were at Dartmouth together. I'm sure Officer Daniels would be sympathetic to a simple misunderstanding between neighbors." He gathered his basket and tools with deliberate slowness. "You might want to review the Homeowner Association bylaws regarding historical plantings. Section 5, paragraph 3, I believe, quite specific about maintenance standards." He paused at the gate. "Change has always come slowly to Oak Ridge, Mississippi. Jackson. Those who try to rush it typically find themselves unwelcome." That night, Emily installed a simple security camera overlooking her backyard. The next morning, she changed the locks on her garden gate, replacing the antique latch with a modern deadbolt. Small boundaries, clearly marked. A quiet declaration of territory that required no confrontation, no escalation, just a silent insistence on her right to control access to her space. Marcus's response came 2 days later in the form of an official notice from the Homeowners Association citing unauthorized modifications to street-visible structures. The garden gate, apparently, was a protected historical feature that couldn't be altered without committee approval. The letter was signed by Marcus Bennett, Architectural Review Chairman. Emily recognized the game being played. This wasn't about peonies or garden gates. This was about establishing who truly controlled the property, the person with legal ownership or the self-appointed custodian of neighborhood heritage. She carefully documented each intrusion, each violation, each abuse of committee power. She studied the HOA bylaws, identifying the actual requirements versus Marcus's creative interpretations. She researched Oak Ridge's preservation laws, distinguishing between legally protected features and merely traditional ones. Knowledge was power, and Emily was quietly accumulating both. But even she wasn't prepared for what happened next. The ring vanished on a Tuesday in early June. Emily discovered its absence while preparing for a crucial client presentation. She had been applying hand cream, a habitual part of her morning routine, when she realized her grandmother's ring was missing from her left hand. "That's weird," she murmured, trying to remember when she'd last noticed it. She'd been weeding the front garden the previous evening, working without gloves because she preferred feeling the soil between her fingers. Had the ring slipped off then? The client couldn't wait, but the moment her presentation ended, Emily rushed home to search. She combed through the garden on hands and knees, sifting soil until her manicure was ruined and her silk blouse stained beyond salvation. Nothing. She emptied drawers, checked beneath furniture, and retraced every step from the previous day. The ring had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. As darkness fell, Emily found herself sitting on her back porch steps, fighting tears of frustration and loss. The ring wasn't just jewelry, it was her connection to Beatrice, the woman who had taught her to stand her ground when the world tried to push her aside. The ring had been there during every significant moment of Emily's adult life. When she'd graduated from Wharton, the first in her family to earn an advanced degree. During her divorce from Stephen, when she'd twisted it nervously throughout their final meeting with the mediator. The night she'd received the promotion that finally put this house within her reach. She had kissed the sapphire in a private gesture of gratitude to the grandmother who had made it all possible. Without the ring, Emily felt unmoored. as if her claim to this new life, this hard-won territory, had somehow been invalidated. A porch light flicked on next door, illuminating Marcus's silhouette as he stepped outside, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. "Everything all right?" he called, his voice carrying the perfect note of neighborly concern. Emily hesitated, then decided there was no harm in asking. "I've lost a ring, my grandmother's, gold band with a sapphire. Have you seen anything like that?" Even in the dim light, she caught the momentary stiffening of his posture, a predator catching scent. "I haven't," he replied after a calculated pause. "When did you last have it?" "Yesterday, I think. I was working in the front garden beds." "Ah," Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Things have a way of disappearing in these old properties. The Simmons boy once lost his championship ring, turned up months later inside a hollow porch column during renovations. He took a contemplative sip from his tumbler. "I have a metal detector you're welcome to borrow, gift from my son last Christmas." The offer was tempting, but Emily had learned to be wary of Marcus's help. "Thanks, but I've pretty thoroughly searched the garden already." "Well, the offer stands." Marcus raised his glass in a small toast. "You know, the Bennett family has quite a collection of historical rings, some dating back to the 1790s. If you're unable to recover your grandmother's, perhaps I could show you some pieces that might serve as a suitable replacement." The suggestion that her irreplaceable family heirloom could simply be substituted with some artifact from his collection felt like a slap. "It's not about the monetary value," Emily said stiffly. "It was my grandmother's." "Of course," Marcus nodded understandingly. "Sentiment. Though I've always found that true historical value transcends personal attachment. These objects outlive us all. What matters is ensuring they're properly preserved for future generations." Something in his tone, a proprietary smugness, triggered a sudden, chilling suspicion in Emily's mind. That night, sleep eluded her. Around 2 a.m., she found herself scrolling through neighborhood Facebook groups, searching for any mention of lost items. What she found instead was a post from Marcus from several months earlier. "Looking to complete my collection of historical Oak Ridge artifacts for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Particularly interested in items from the original families, Bennett, Caldwell, Simmons, Harper, willing to offer generous compensation." The post included photos of various antique items, old keys, letters, photographs, and jewelry. Emily's heart stuttered as she zoomed in on the collection of rings Marcus had already acquired. Several featured sapphires in settings similar to her grandmother's ring. Further investigation revealed more posts stretching back years. Marcus didn't just live in Oak Ridge, he collected it, piece by piece, item by item. His home was filled with artifacts from other properties in the neighborhood, items he had deemed historically significant regardless of their original owner's attachment to them. A sickening theory began to form in Emily's mind. What if her ring hadn't been lost? What if it had been taken, not for its monetary value, but because Marcus somehow believed it belonged in his collection? The idea seemed paranoid, even to her. And yet, morning found Emily calling in sick to work, something she had done only twice in her entire career. Instead of heading to her downtown office, she drove to the local historical society, where Marcus was known to volunteer. The building was quiet when she arrived, just a few elderly visitors browsing displays of faded photographs and Civil War memorabilia. A young woman at the reception desk looked up with a smile. "Welcome to the Oak Ridge Historical Society. Are you interested in our founding family's exhibit?" "Actually," Emily said, "I was hoping to speak with Marcus Bennett. Is he here today?" The receptionist's smile brightened. "Doctor, Bennett usually comes in on Thursdays, but you're in luck. He dropped off some new items for the display this morning. He's in the archives room." She pointed toward a doorway at the back of the building. The archives room was climate-controlled and smelled of preserved paper and wood polish. Through the glass panel in the door, Emily could see Marcus bent over a table, carefully arranging items in a display case. He was wearing white cotton gloves and using tweezers to position something small and shiny. Emily's heart stuttered. From this distance, she couldn't be certain, but the object caught the light in a way that was achingly familiar. She pushed open the door without knocking. "Marcus?" He startled visibly, nearly dropping the tweezers. His body shifted instinctively, partially blocking her view of the display case. "Emily! What a surprise!" His recovery was quick, but not quick enough to hide the flash of alarm in his eyes. "I didn't know you had an interest in local history." "I'm developing one," Emily replied, moving closer with deliberate steps. The room suddenly felt too small, too close, the air between them charged with unspoken accusation. "What are you working on?" Marcus hesitated before stepping aside with curatorial pride. "Just preparing some items for the Founders' Day exhibit. We're featuring artifacts from the original Oak Ridge families." Emily looked down at the display case. There, nestled among antique pocket watches and yellowed letters, was a collection of rings, including one that made her blood freeze in her veins. Gold band, sapphire stone, a tiny nick on the inside that she had always meant to have repaired, her grandmother's ring. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The sheer audacity of it, her ring, stolen from her hand, now being prepared for public display as if it had always belonged to Oak Ridge. "That's an interesting collection," she finally managed, her voice unnaturally calm. "Where did they come from?" "Various sources," Marcus replied vaguely, watching her face with the careful attention of a man accustomed to managing confrontations. "Donations mostly, some items recovered from properties during renovations." "And that one?" Emily pointed directly at her grandmother's ring, her finger trembling slightly. "The sapphire?" Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, caution perhaps. "A calculation of risk versus reward. Found it just yesterday, actually, in the garden bed between our properties." He smiled benevolently. "I recognized it from your description. Was going to return it, of course, but wanted to document it first. The sapphire setting is quite similar to designs popular in Oak Ridge during the 1920s. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment, Emily almost doubted herself. Almost. "It's not from the 1920s, she said flatly. "It's my grandmother's ring. She bought it in Chicago in 1957. Marcus's smile didn't waver. "Are you certain?" These old family stories often get distorted over time. The Simmons had a similar ring that belonged to Eleanor Simmons in the early 20th century. Perhaps your grandmother purchased it from the family without knowing its provenance. The insinuation was clear. Marcus believed the ring somehow belonged to Oak Ridge's history, to his collection, more than it belonged to Emily. More disturbing was the implication that he had been watching her closely enough to notice the ring, covet it, and seize an opportunity to take it. "My grandmother never set foot in Oak Ridge," Emily stated firmly. "She lived her entire life in Chicago. And I'd like my ring back now, please." For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. His eyes, cold, calculating, possessive, remained fixed on the sapphire. Emily could almost see the internal struggle, his genuine belief that he had more right to the ring than she did, battling with his need to maintain his carefully cultivated image as Oak Ridge's benevolent guardian. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he lifted the ring from the display using the tweezers. "Of course, I was merely preserving it until I could return it to you." He held it out, still gripped in the tweezers rather than placing it directly in her palm. "Though I would be remiss if I didn't mention that items of historical significance to the community might be better preserved in our collection." Emily took the ring, resisting the urge to snatch it from the metal grip. As she slipped it back onto her finger, she noticed something she hadn't before. A tiny scratch on the band that hadn't been there previously, as if someone had tested it, perhaps for metal content or authenticity. "Thank you for finding it," she said stiffly, already backing toward the door, needing to escape the suffocating presence of this man who had touched her most personal possession, who had taken it from her property, possibly directly from her hand, with the casual entitlement of someone who believed he had every right to do so. Marcus nodded graciously, as if he were the one doing her a favor. That's what neighbors are for, looking out for each other's interests. The emphasis on the final word sent a chill down Emily's spine. The violation of having her ring taken, literally from her hand, changed something fundamental in Emily's approach to Marcus Bennett. This wasn't just about property boundaries or garden access anymore. This was about security, about safety, about the basic right to exist in her home without fearing theft or invasion. That evening, she upgraded her security system, adding cameras that covered every approach to her house. She installed motion sensor lights. She began documenting every interaction with Marcus with obsessive detail, dates, times, exact wording. Corporate America had taught her that power rarely yielded to direct confrontation. Entitlement like Marcus's, wrapped in charm and community standing, was particularly resistant to frontal assault. What worked instead was methodical documentation, strategic alliance building, and the careful exposure of patterns that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Emily began researching Marcus beyond his historical society volunteer work. What emerged was disturbing. Marcus had retired early from his university position following complaints from female graduate students about his proprietary attitude toward their research. 3 years earlier, a family who had briefly owned the house on the other side of Marcus had moved out after just 6 months, citing neighborhood problems in their listing. Most tellingly, Emily discovered a small claims court case from 5 years earlier. The plaintiff, Theodore Harper, whose name matched one of the founding families Marcus had mentioned, had sued Marcus for the return of a pocket watch. The court had ruled in Harper's favor, with the judge noting in his decision that the defendant's claim that items of historical significance to the town supersede individual ownership rights has no basis in law. The picture emerging wasn't of a simple busybody neighbor, or even an entitled community leader. It was of a man with a pathological need to possess and control, not just physical objects, but the very narrative of Oak Ridge itself. A man who genuinely believed that his family's historical connection to the town gave him special rights over other people's property, other people's lives, other people's stories. But why? What drove Marcus Bennett's obsessive need to claim ownership of Oak Ridge's past? Emily found her answer in an unexpected place, the town library's digital archives. Specifically, in a 1986 newspaper article about the death of Marcus's father, Elias Bennett. The article painted a complex picture. Elias, it seemed, had once been Oak Ridge's most esteemed citizen, mayor for 3 terms, founder of the Historical Society, and a generous donor to community causes. But his final years had been marked by controversy. He had opposed the development of affordable housing on the outskirts of town, claiming the land was of historical significance to the Bennett family. When the town council voted against him, Elias had grown increasingly erratic, making wild claims about his ancestral rights to Oak Ridge. A sidebar to the article included a quote from Elias's wife, Margaret. "My husband devoted his life to preserving Oak Ridge's heritage. He couldn't bear to see the town changing, evolving beyond his vision of what it should be. In the end, I think he confused preservation with possession." The same article mentioned that their son, Marcus, had just completed his PhD in American history with a dissertation titled The Bennett Legacy, 3 Centuries of Historical Stewardship in New England. Emily sat back, the pieces falling into place. Marcus wasn't just continuing his father's work. He was trying to redeem it, prove that Elias's increasingly paranoid claims of ownership over Oak Ridge had been justified. Every item Marcus preserved, every boundary he erased, every tradition he enforced was an attempt to validate his father's descent into territorial delusion. In a twisted way, it made sense. Marcus's entire identity was built on the foundation of Bennett family significance. If that significance were questioned, if the Bennett name became just one among many in Oak Ridge's history, what would remain of his sense of self? It wasn't merely that Marcus believed he owned Oak Ridge's history. He believed Oak Ridge's history owned him, defined him, justified him, gave him purpose and position in a world that might otherwise see him as merely a retired professor with too much time on his hands. Understanding Marcus's motivations didn't excuse his actions, but it gave Emily insight into her adversary, and insight was power. Her security cameras proved her suspicions correct. 3 times in the following week, they captured Marcus entering her property while she was at work. He wasn't checking the gardens or accessing the backyard. He was testing her doors, peering through her windows, examining the items visible on her porch. On the 4th visit, he brought something truly chilling, a key that he attempted to use on her front door. It didn't work. Emily had changed the locks immediately after the ring incident, but the attempt confirmed her worst fears. Marcus Bennett believed he had the right to enter her home whenever he chose. She needed allies, but she had to be strategic. Marcus had spent decades cultivating his image in Oak Ridge. A direct accusation from a newcomer would likely backfire, reinforcing his narrative that outsiders didn't understand or respect the community's traditions. Her opportunity came at the annual Founders' Day celebration held in the town square. Emily circulated through the crowd, introducing herself as the new owner of the Simmons property. She was careful never to mention Marcus directly, instead asking innocent questions about neighborhood traditions and property boundaries. "Is it common for neighbors to have access to each other's gardens here?" she would ask. Or, "I've noticed someone in my backyard when I'm at work. Is that normal in Oak Ridge?" The responses were revealing. Most people seemed uncomfortable with the questions, changing the subject or making vague references to traditional arrangements. But a few, particularly newer residents, expressed concern. "You might want to check your property lines," a woman named Jennifer whispered when Marcus was across the square. "When we moved in last year, we discovered our fence was 2 feet inside our actual property line. Apparently, it had been moved years ago in a gentleman's agreement that was never documented." Jennifer Parker, Emily would later learn, was a pediatric surgeon who had moved to Oak Ridge with her husband and twin daughters. Her initial enthusiasm about their historic home had quickly soured when Marcus appointed himself their unofficial guide to appropriate renovations. "He actually brought paint samples to our house," Jennifer confided over coffee the following week. "Told us the previous owners had always used Bennett blue, turned out to be a custom shade his great-grandmother had created. When we chose a different color, we suddenly started receiving HOA violation notices for everything from our mailbox design to the height of our shrubs." A man named Robert pulled Emily aside near the lemonade stand at the Founders' Day celebration. "Bennett been in your backyard?" he asked bluntly. When Emily nodded, he sighed. "He claimed my grandfather's service revolver was an Oak Ridge artifact because Grandpa had been police chief here in the 70s, had to threaten legal action to get it back." Robert Johnson was a 3rd-generation Oak Ridge resident, one of the few black families in the historically white enclave. His grandfather had broken barriers by becoming the town's first black police officer in 1962, eventually rising to chief in 1975. The service revolver had been presented to him upon retirement, engraved with his name and years of service. "Marcus came to the house after Grandpa's funeral," Robert explained during a later conversation. "Said he was cataloging items of historical significance. Next thing we knew, the revolver was in a display case at the Historical Society. When we asked for it back, he claimed it was community property because it represented a significant era in Oak Ridge law enforcement." By the end of the day, Emily had exchanged contact information with 6 other homeowners who had experienced similar issues with Marcus. None had been willing to speak up alone, fearing they would be seen as troublemakers in a community where the Bennett name carried significant weight. But together they might finally be able to challenge Marcus's decades-long campaign of entitlement and appropriation. Emily invited them all to a casual dinner at her home the following Friday. She was careful with the framing, not a meeting to complain about Marcus, but a new neighbor get-together to discuss preserving both history and appropriate boundaries in our unique community. All 6 accepted. The night of the dinner arrived, bringing with it a palpable sense of anticipation. Emily had prepared a simple but elegant meal, more focused on creating a comfortable space for honest conversation than impressing her guests. Jennifer was the first to arrive, looking nervously over her shoulder as she hurried up the front walk. "I should warn you," she said, as Emily took her coat. "Marcus knows about this dinner. He cornered me at the grocery store yesterday, asking why I would attend a gathering at the new neighbor's house when I hadn't yet accepted his standing invitation to the Bennett Historical Society meetings." Emily's stomach tightened. "What did you tell him?" "That I was interested in meeting more neighbors my age." Jennifer lowered her voice, though they were alone in the foyer. "He didn't believe me. Said something about coordinated efforts to undermine community traditions being historically unsuccessful in Oak Ridge." The implied threat hung in the air between them, underscoring exactly why this dinner was necessary. Over the next 15 minutes, all of Emily's invited guests arrived, plus one unexpected addition. Robert, the man who had warned her about Marcus, had brought his elderly father, Howard. "Dad insisted on coming when I told him where I was headed tonight," Robert explained. "He has some stories you might find interesting." Howard Johnson, no relation to Marcus, he emphasized with a wink, was in his mid-80s with bright eyes that missed nothing and hands gnarled by arthritis, but still strong. "Lived here all my life," he explained, accepting a glass of wine from Emily. "Knew Marcus's father and his grandfather before him. The Bennett boys have always had a selective view of local history." Once everyone had arrived, Emily guided them to her dining room. The conversation flowed easily at first, focused on innocuous topics, the weather, local restaurants, the upcoming summer festival. It wasn't until they were midway through the main course that Emily gently steered the discussion toward the real purpose of their gathering. "I've had some unusual experiences with property boundaries since moving in," she began. "I'm curious if that's common here." The floodgates opened. Each guest had a story. Robert's struggle to reclaim his grandfather's revolver, Jennifer's discovery that her fence had been moved, a couple named Michael and David who had found Marcus giving a tour of their historic home's garden to historical society members without permission. "He had a key," Michael said incredulously. "We never gave him a key, but somehow he had one. Said the previous owners had provided it for historical documentation purposes." Michael Chen and David Rodriguez had purchased their Victorian home 2 years earlier, attracted by its architectural details and spacious garden. Both worked in Boston, Michael as an architect, David as an immigration attorney, and had initially appreciated Marcus's apparent knowledge about their home's history. "At first, we thought he was just being neighborly," David explained. "He brought over old photographs of the house, told us stories about previous owners. It was interesting, until we realized he expected to have input on every decision we made about our property." Michael nodded. "When we removed an interior wall to open up the kitchen, a wall that wasn't even original to the house, he actually brought a group of historical society members to our front door to protest the destruction of Oak Ridge heritage. They stood on our lawn with actual signs." Howard, who had been quietly listening, set down his fork with a deliberate motion that immediately drew everyone's attention. "It's not just Marcus," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "It's 3 generations of Bennett men who believed they were the custodians of Oak Ridge, not just its history, but its present and future too. The room fell silent as Howard continued, his eyes distant with memory. Marcus's grandfather, Elias Bennett Sr., was the worst of them. Used to walk into people's homes unannounced, claimed he was inspecting for historical accuracy, called it his custodial duty to Oak Ridge. Howard's weathered face creased in a humorless smile. What you're all experiencing isn't new. It's just that no one's ever managed to coordinate any opposition before. He leaned forward, his voice dropping as if sharing a secret. You have to understand something about the Bennetts. They came to Oak Ridge in 1796, but they weren't founders, they were land speculators. Bought property cheap from struggling farmers, then sold it at a profit to Boston merchants looking for country estates. This revelation drew surprised looks from around the table. The Bennett legacy Marcus is always going on about. It's a carefully constructed myth. His grandfather started it in the 1920s when old money was losing ground to new industry. The Bennetts were wealthy, but they weren't Cabots or lodges. They needed significance. Howard's gaze swept the table. So they created it, rewrote Oak Ridge's history with themselves at the center, founded the Historical Society specifically to control the narrative, and for 3 generations, it worked. The Bennett version of history became the official version. Emily glanced around the table at the faces of her neighbors, some angry, some fearful, all clearly relieved to discover they weren't alone in their experiences. Which is exactly what we need to change now, she said, pulling out a folder she'd prepared. I have a plan, but it will only work if we do it together. She explained her strategy, a systematic, community-based approach to reclaiming their boundaries. No dramatic confrontations, no angry accusations, just clear documentation, mutual support, and a unified front. First, they would all install security cameras and document any boundary violations. Second, they would meet with an attorney specializing in property law to review their deeds and property lines, correcting any historical adjustments that had no legal basis. Third, they would change their locks and explicitly revoke any traditional access that Marcus or anyone else claimed to have to their properties. Finally, they would collectively present their documentation to both the town council and the Historical Society board, requesting a formal review of the Historical Society's collection practices and Marcus's role in them. The key, Emily emphasized, is that we do this together. Marcus has maintained his influence because he picks his targets carefully, usually one at a time, often newcomers or those without deep community connections. Howard nodded approvingly. Strength in numbers. It's how we handled Elias Bennett Sr. back in the 60s when he tried to block the development of the public park, claimed the land was part of the Bennett Historical Preserve, which was news to everyone else in town. Jennifer raised her hand hesitantly. What about retaliation? Marcus chairs 3 different town committees. He has friends on the zoning board, the historical commission. That's why documentation is crucial, Emily replied. This isn't about personal grievances. It's about establishing a pattern of behavior that violates actual laws and regulations. The same corporate politics that make direct confrontation ineffective make documented patterns nearly impossible to dismiss. Michael leaned forward. I'm in. David and I have been talking about leaving Oak Ridge, but honestly, I'm tired of running. This is our home. We shouldn't have to leave because one man has appointed himself the arbiter of who belongs here. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. For the first time, Emily saw something beyond resignation or fear in her neighbor's eyes. She saw resolve, determination, perhaps even hope. As the evening wound down, the group had formed a plan and a text group to coordinate their efforts. For the first time since moving to Oak Ridge, Emily felt like she had found her community, not the artificial one Marcus had tried to enforce, but a genuine connection with neighbors who shared her values. They were saying their goodbyes at the front door when Howard pulled Emily aside. "That ring you're wearing," he said quietly, nodding toward her grandmother's ring. "Bennett tried to claim it, didn't he?" Emily looked down at the sapphire, surprised. "How did you know?" Howard's weathered face darkened. "Because he tried the same thing with my wife's brooch back in '76. Said it matched the description of a piece that had belonged to Eliza Bennett in the 1880s. The old man's eyes flashed with decades-old anger. Marion set him straight, told him the brooch had been made in Chicago in 1945 and had never been within 100 miles of Oak Ridge until she moved here. Emily's fingers instinctively curled around her ring. "My grandmother's ring has a similar story. Made in Chicago, never near Oak Ridge until I moved here. And yet he tried to take it from you." It wasn't a question. Emily nodded, the memory still raw. "I found it in his Historical Society display case. He claimed he'd found it in his garden and was documenting it before returning it to me." Howard's expression hardened. "That's his pattern. First he covets, then he creates a narrative about why the item is historically significant to Oak Ridge, then he takes it, usually when the owner is away or distracted." "But why?" "He has his own collection, his own family heirlooms." Howard was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "The Bennetts lost most of their fortune in the Depression. The imposing family home, the vintage Bentley, the tailored suits, it's all facade. Marcus's father mortgaged everything to maintain appearances." He gestured toward the Bennett house, its elegant proportions softly illuminated by landscape lighting. Marcus grew up watching his father struggle to maintain the Bennett family myth while their actual legacy crumbled. When Elias died, Marcus was left with a mountain of debt and a desperate need to prove that the family's historical significance was worth more than their financial reality. Howard tapped Emily's ring. "Hold on to that. Some things aren't meant for public collections, no matter how historical someone might claim they are. And watch your back. Marcus is never more dangerous than when he feels his narrative slipping away." Over the next 3 months, Emily and her new allies implemented their plan methodically. Security footage revealed that Marcus had been entering at least 4 properties regularly without permission. Property surveys discovered 3 cases of fences that had been moved from their legal boundaries years ago. Most disturbingly, a locksmith found that all of their homes used the same master key system, an unusual arrangement that had been installed decades earlier during a time when Marcus's father had served as head of the Homeowners Association. It explained how Marcus had access to so many properties without forced entry. For Emily, this discovery was particularly chilling. The idea that Marcus could have entered her home at any time, perhaps even while she slept, made her install a state-of-the-art security system with alerts that went directly to her phone. The group met weekly, sharing new evidence and supporting each other through Marcus's escalating attempts to reassert control. When Jennifer received a letter questioning her property tax assessment, clearly orchestrated by Marcus through his connection with the town assessor, the group helped her file a formal appeal with documented evidence of the property's actual value. When David and Michael's historic home was suddenly scheduled for an emergency inspection due to anonymous safety concerns, Robert, whose cousin worked in the building department, ensured that the inspector who arrived was thorough, professional, and immune to Marcus's influence. Each small victory strengthened their resolve. Each documented incident built their case. And through it all, they were careful to maintain an outward appearance of normal neighborhood relations, attending community events, participating in town meetings, even exchanging polite greetings with Marcus himself when their paths crossed. Emily found herself drawing on every skill she'd developed in the corporate world. The ability to smile pleasantly while taking detailed mental notes of a colleague's undermining comments, the patience to build a case methodically rather than reacting emotionally, the strategic insight to recognize when to push forward and when to hold back. But what surprised her most was how much she had come to care about Oak Ridge. Not the sanitized, Bennett-approved version Marcus promoted, but the complex, diverse community that existed beneath that facade. Through her allies, she was discovering the town's true history, the contributions of families like the Johnsons, who had fought for civil rights from within Oak Ridge's predominantly white confines. The artistic legacy of Eleanor Simmons, whose garden designs had been featured in national magazines but were barely mentioned in the Historical Society's archives because she had once rejected Elias Bennett's advances. Oak Ridge was far more interesting, more nuanced than Marcus's carefully curated narrative allowed. And the more Emily learned, the more determined she became to help restore the community's full, messy, authentic history. When they were ready, when their documentation was irrefutable and their allies secure, Emily called a meeting with the town council and historical society board. The conference room at the town hall was packed, not just with official members, but with curious residents who had heard rumors of a challenge to Marcus Bennett's authority. Marcus himself sat at the head table, his posture relaxed, his expression benignly interested, a man secure in his position, certain that whatever challenge was coming would be easily dismissed. Emily approached the podium, pulse racing but voice steady. Years of corporate presentations had prepared her for high-stakes moments like this. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," she began. "I've been a resident of Oak Ridge for just over 6 months, and in that time, I've come to appreciate this community's deep respect for its history." Marcus nodded approvingly, clearly expecting another newcomer's tribute to Oak Ridge's traditions. What he got instead was a systematic dismantling of his decades-long campaign of entitlement and appropriation. Emily presented her evidence methodically: security footage of Marcus entering multiple properties without permission, documentation of boundary markers that had been moved, testimony from homeowners whose possessions had been taken for historical preservation without consent. "This isn't about disrespecting Oak Ridge's history," Emily emphasized. "It's about ensuring that respect for the past doesn't become a tool for violating citizens' legal rights in the present." She gestured to Jennifer, who came forward with enlarged photographs showing how her property line had been systematically shifted over the years, each small adjustment documented in surveys from different decades. Robert shared the story of his grandfather's service revolver, producing the court documents that had forced its return, and evidence that similar items were still being held in the Historical Society's collection without proper provenance documentation. Michael and David presented a log of uninvited tours Marcus had conducted through their garden, complete with dates, times, and statements from embarrassed Historical Society members who had been told the tours were authorized. The room had fallen utterly silent, all eyes moving between Emily and Marcus, whose benevolent expression had hardened into something cold and defensive. "Furthermore," Emily continued, "we have documentation of at least 12 items currently in the Historical Society's collection that were acquired without proper consent from their owners." She placed a folder on the table, "including items that have been reported stolen." At this, Marcus could remain silent no longer. He rose to his feet, his composure slipping for the first time in Emily's experience. "This is outrageous," he declared, voice tight with barely controlled anger. "These artifacts belong in our collection. These newcomers," he gestured dismissively toward Emily and several of her allies, "have no understanding of Oak Ridge's unique heritage. They seek to dismantle traditions that have preserved our community's character for generations." The veins in his neck stood out, his face flushing a deep crimson as decades of unchallenged authority crumbled before him. His eyes, usually calculating and controlled, now blazed with the raw emotion of a man watching his kingdom fall. "I've dedicated my life to this town." His voice rose, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I've preserved what others would have discarded, protected what others would have destroyed. Without me, Oak Ridge's history would be sold to the highest bidder or thrown away by people who don't understand its value." Emily had anticipated this reaction. In fact, she had counted on it. on Marcus revealing his true motivations, not as a benevolent guardian of history, but as a man desperate to control a narrative that placed him at its center. "Dr. Bennett," she said calmly, her voice a stark contrast to his emotional outburst. "This isn't about erasing history. It's about ensuring that history doesn't become an excuse for theft and trespassing." She turned to face the room directly, making eye contact with each board member. "What you're witnessing right now is exactly what happens when any of us challenge Dr. Bennett's authority. He doesn't believe he's preserving Oak Ridge's history. He believes he owns it. And by extension, he believes he owns anything and anyone connected to it." Marcus slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "You have no right!" he shouted, years of carefully cultivated civility completely abandoned. "You've been here 6 months. My family built this town. We made Oak Ridge what it is." In that moment, Emily saw what truly drove Marcus Bennett. Not love of history, but fear of irrelevance. Fear that without his self-appointed role as guardian of Oak Ridge's past, he would have no place in its future. Howard Johnson rose shakily to his feet, leaning on his cane. "I've lived in this town for 86 years, Marcus. My family was here before yours, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Oak Ridge was never meant to be any one family's kingdom." The old man's quiet dignity silenced even Marcus temporarily. "What you call tradition, the rest of us call control. What you call preservation, we call possession." Howard's weathered hand gestured toward the evidence Emily had presented. "It stops now." The Historical Society president, a retired judge who had known Marcus for decades, cleared her throat. "I believe we've heard enough. The board will need to review these serious allegations in private." She fixed Marcus with a stern gaze. "In the meantime, Dr. Bennett, I think it would be appropriate for you to step down from your committee positions until this matter is resolved." Marcus looked around the room, searching for allies, for the deference he'd come to expect as his birthright. Finding none, something seemed to break within him. His shoulders slumped, the facade of distinguished authority dissolving completely. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he said, voice suddenly quiet but threaded with venom. "This town needs me. You need me." His gaze locked on Emily, intense and unblinking. "And you? You think this is over? This is my home, my heritage. I won't be pushed aside by some outsider who doesn't understand what Oak Ridge means." The threat hung in the air, explicit and unmistakable. Emily met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "I understand exactly what Oak Ridge means, Dr. Bennett. It means community. It means respect for boundaries. It means honoring the past without stealing from the present." She twisted her grandmother's ring, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "And it means standing up to bullies no matter how long they've been allowed to operate." For a moment, the tension between them crackled like lightning, the culmination of months of quiet conflict now erupting into open confrontation. Then Marcus turned on his heel and stalked from the room, the door slamming behind him with finality. As he left, Emily caught a glimpse of something she hadn't expected to see in Marcus Bennett's eyes, not just anger or wounded pride, but genuine fear. The fear of a man who had just watched his carefully constructed identity begin to crumble. The fallout was both swift and gradual, like a landslide that begins with a few stones before becoming an avalanche. First came the official investigation. The Historical Society Board, deeply embarrassed by the evidence Emily and her allies had presented, hired an independent curator to audit their collection. The results were damning. Nearly 30% of the items Marcus had donated over the years had questionable provenance. Some had been directly taken from local homes under the guise of historical preservation. The police became involved when they discovered several items that had been reported stolen over the years, including a Civil War-era pocket watch that had disappeared from the Harper family's home during a renovation project Marcus had helpfully supervised. Marcus's reputation, built over decades of careful manipulation and selective generosity, collapsed virtually overnight. Former supporters distanced themselves, claiming they'd always found him a bit intense or had suspected something wasn't quite right. The historical reverence the Bennett name had once commanded turned to suspicion, and in some cases, open contempt. For Emily, the victory brought mixed emotions. She hadn't set out to destroy Marcus Bennett, only to protect herself and her neighbors from his invasive behavior. Watching the man's public humiliation gave her no pleasure. It only underscored how deeply his sense of self had been entwined with his illusory authority. But the most profound change wasn't in how Oak Ridge viewed Marcus Bennett. It was in how the community viewed itself. The morning after the town meeting, Emily found a basket on her porch filled with fresh baked bread and homemade jam. The attached note read simply, "From a grateful neighbor." Similar offerings appeared at the homes of others who had spoken out against Marcus. Small gestures of solidarity and appreciation from residents who had been silently chafing under the Bennett family's self-appointed authority for years. 3 weeks later, as Emily was tending to Eleanor Simmons's peonies, which she now thought of as her own, a shadow fell across the garden. She looked up to see an elderly woman leaning on a cane, watching her with interested eyes. "Mrs. Simmons?" Emily asked, recognizing her from photos in the historical archives. The woman nodded. "I heard what happened. Thought I should come see for myself." Her gaze traveled over the garden, lingering on the blooming peonies. "You've taken good care of them." "I've tried," Emily admitted, "though I'm still learning." Mrs. Simmons smiled. "That's all any of us can do." She hesitated, then added, "You should know, we never gave Marcus permission to enter our property. My husband tried to set boundaries for years, but Marcus always found ways around them. When Leonard's health declined, it just became easier to give in than to fight." Emily stood, brushing soil from her knees. "Would you like some tea? I'd love to hear about the house, the real history, not Marcus's version." That afternoon became the first of many conversations with former owners and longtime residents who shared their stories of the house on Maple Street, not as a historical artifact to be preserved in amber, but as a living home that had sheltered generations of families through their messy, imperfect, deeply human lives. Emily learned about the hidden compartment beneath the kitchen floorboards, where the Johnson family, who had owned the house during Prohibition, had stored bootleg whiskey, about the summer of 1972 when Eleanor Simmons had hosted secret meetings for women's rights activists in the garden pavilion, about the teenager who had carved his initials into the oak tree in 1954 and later returned as an old man to show his grandchildren. These stories, personal, sometimes ordinary, always authentic, were the true history of Oak Ridge. Not the sanitized, Bennett-approved narrative that had dominated for decades, but the complex tapestry of actual lived experiences that made a community real. Marcus himself had retreated into his colonial, blinds drawn, emerging only for necessary errands. The investigation into his collection had expanded to include allegations of theft going back decades. His son, a corporate attorney in Boston who had rarely visited Oak Ridge, arrived to manage the legal fallout, looking harried and embarrassed by his father's behavior. 2 months after the town meeting, Emily was startled by her doorbell ringing at dusk. She opened the door to find Marcus Bennett's son, Alexander, standing on her porch, his expression grave. "Ms. Jackson, I'm Alexander Bennett. I was hoping we could speak briefly." Emily hesitated, then stepped back to allow him inside. Unlike his father, Alexander waited to be invited before crossing her threshold. "My father has been diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia," Alexander said without preamble once they were seated in Emily's living room. "It's been progressing for years, apparently, though none of us recognize the signs. His behavior, the collecting, the boundary violations, the sense of entitlement, they're all symptoms of the condition." Emily absorbed this information silently, uncertain how it should change her perspective on the months of intrusion and theft she had experienced. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Alexander continued, reading her expression. "What he did was wrong, regardless of the medical explanation. But I wanted you to know that he's being properly cared for now, and that steps are being taken to return items to their rightful owners." He placed a manila envelope on the coffee table between them. "These are the keys my father had, to your home, to several others in the neighborhood. I've already spoken with Mrs. Johnson and the Millers. You're the last on my list." Emily looked at the envelope, thinking of all the boundaries these keys had violated over the years. "Thank you for returning them." Alexander nodded, then hesitated before adding, "He talked about you, you know." In his more lucid moments, said you reminded him of his mother. She was the only one who ever stood up to his father. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The Bennett men have a type, it seems. Strong-willed women who refuse to be intimidated." "Your grandmother stood up to your grandfather?" Emily asked, curious despite herself. Alexander's expression softened. Margaret Bennett was quite the woman, by all accounts. While Elias was busy building his myth about the Bennett legacy, she was quietly running a women's literacy program for immigrant families. It wasn't considered appropriate for a Bennett to associate with those people, so she did it under her maiden name. He shook his head. "My father never forgave her for having a life that didn't revolve around preserving the family narrative." Emily thought about Marcus, about the emotional outburst at the town meeting, the naked fear in his eyes as his carefully constructed world collapsed. "It must be difficult," she said carefully, "to discover your entire identity is built on a foundation that doesn't actually exist." "That's exactly it." Alexander looked surprised at her insight. When the dementia began to progress, his first symptoms weren't memory loss. They were an intensification of his need to control Oak Ridge's narrative, as if he sensed something slipping away and was desperately trying to hold on to it. After Alexander left, Emily stood at her front window, watching as he walked back to his father's house. The Bennett colonial looked different now, not a symbol of entitlement and tradition, but simply a home where a troubled man was living out his final chapter. She twisted her grandmother's ring, feeling its familiar weight, thinking of all it represented. Not just Beatrice's life, but Emily's own journey of standing her ground when the world tried to push her aside. "When the world pushes, you plant your feet," she murmured, echoing her grandmother's words. The revelation of Marcus's illness didn't excuse his actions, but it did cast them in a different light. A desperate man clinging to a dissolving sense of self was, in some ways, more understandable than a purely malicious one. The behavior was the same. The motivations were more complex. Emily wondered what would have happened if Marcus had been diagnosed earlier, if his intensifying symptoms had been recognized as medical rather than merely personal. How many boundaries might have remained unviolated? How many treasured possessions might have stayed with their rightful owners? These questions had no answers, of course, and they didn't change what Emily and her allies had needed to do to protect themselves and their community. But they did remind her that even the most seemingly villainous figures in our lives are ultimately human, subject to the same frailties and failings that affect us all. It was a humbling realization, and one that made her feel both more compassionate toward Marcus and more determined to ensure that what had happened in Oak Ridge never happened again. 1 year after moving to Oak Ridge, Emily hosted a garden party. The peonies were in full bloom, their heavy pink heads nodding in the early summer breeze. Children played tag across the lawn that now blended seamlessly with Jennifer's yard next door, the property line fence having been removed by mutual agreement after a proper survey confirmed the boundaries. Howard Johnson sat in a place of honor beneath the ancient oak tree, regaling younger residents with stories of Oak Ridge's true history, not the sanitized, Bennett-centric version Marcus had propagated, but the messy, diverse reality of a town built by many families, many traditions, many hands. The thing about history, Howard told a circle of attentive listeners, including Jennifer's twin daughters and Robert's teenage son, is that it doesn't belong to any one person or family. It belongs to all of us, those who lived it, those who preserve it, and those who will carry it forward. Emily moved among her guests, refilling glasses and exchanging stories. The house on Maple Street had become what she had always intended, not just her private sanctuary, but a place of genuine community and connection. Jennifer, now serving as the newest member of the Historical Society board, was deep in conversation with Mrs. Simmons about creating an oral history project to capture the memories of Oak Ridge's oldest residents. "We're thinking of calling it Voices of Oak Ridge," Jennifer explained to Emily as she passed by with a tray of refreshments. "Eleanor has agreed to be our first subject. Did you know she designed gardens for 3 governors? Marcus never included that in the Historical Society's records because she refused to credit her designs as Bennett-inspired. Michael and David, who had ultimately decided to stay in Oak Ridge rather than move back to Boston, were showing Howard a recently discovered photograph of his father standing proudly in front of their Victorian home in 1945, a piece of actual history that had been overlooked in favor of the Bennett-approved narrative. "We found it in a box in the attic," David explained. "There were dozens of photos of previous owners that never made it into the Historical Society's archives. We're thinking of having an exhibition." Robert, who had recently been elected to the town council, was discussing plans for a new community garden on land that had once been earmarked for an expansion of the Bennett Memorial Park. "We're calling it Unity Gardens," he told a group of interested neighbors. "Each section will be designed to reflect the cultural heritage of different families in Oak Ridge, including plants from their countries of origin." As the evening light cast long shadows across the lawn, Emily found herself standing at the edge of Eleanor's peony bed. Mrs. Simmons had taught her the proper care techniques during one of her regular visits, passing on knowledge that had nothing to do with historical preservation, and everything to do with the simple joy of watching something beautiful thrive under your care. Emily twisted her grandmother's ring, watching the sapphire catch the fading sunlight. The small scratch Marcus had left on the band remained, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing this connection to her past. But rather than diminishing the ring's value, the scratch had somehow enhanced it, adding another layer to its story. Just as the scratch on her ring had become part of its history, so too had Marcus Bennett's actions become part of Oak Ridge's story. Not the glorious legacy he had imagined for himself, but a cautionary tale of entitlement masquerading as tradition, of possession disguised as preservation. The community had learned from it, grown stronger through the challenge of confronting it. The Historical Society was now led by a diverse board that included both longtime residents and newcomers. The Homeowners Association had been reformed, its bylaws rewritten to protect individual property rights while respecting genuine historical considerations. And Emily's home, once the battlefield in a quiet war over boundaries and belonging, had become exactly what she had intended when she first stood on its porch with the keys in her hand, her place in the world, hard-won and unquestionably hers. Alexander Bennett had sold his father's house to a young family with 3 children who were now happily playing beneath the oak tree. Marcus himself was living in a memory care facility in Boston, where Alexander could visit regularly. The last Emily had heard, he was responding well to treatment, though his memories of Oak Ridge had become increasingly fragmented and confused. In an unexpected twist of clemency, the Historical Society had not pressed charges for the items Marcus had taken without permission. Instead, they had focused on returning each piece to its rightful owner, accompanied by a formal apology and an invitation to share the actual story behind the item for the Society's revised archives. Emily often thought about the complex emotions that had accompanied her victory over Marcus. There had been satisfaction, of course, the deep contentment of having protected something that mattered to her. But there had also been unexpected empathy for a man whose entire identity had been built around a myth he hadn't created but had desperately tried to maintain. The discovery of his illness had complicated things further. It didn't excuse the violations or the theft, but it did reframe them, casting Marcus not as a villain in her story, but as a person fighting his own losing battle against irrelevance and dissolution. In the end, what Emily had reclaimed wasn't just her grandmother's ring or her property boundaries. She had reclaimed the right to determine her own place in the world, to define herself not through someone else's narrative, but through her own choices and connections. As twilight deepened into dusk, Howard raised his glass in a toast. To Oak Ridge, not as it was, not as any one person wants it to be, but as we create it together, day by day. Emily touched her glass to his, feeling the cool metal of her grandmother's ring against the crystal. And to the treasures we keep, she added softly, not because they belong to history, but because they belong to us. Around them, neighbors and friends raised their glasses, the simple gesture binding them together in a moment that needed no historical plaque, no curatorial ownership, no preservation beyond memory and connection. Emily thought of her grandmother, of the strength Beatrice had passed down to her, not just through a sapphire ring, but through the quiet determination to stand her ground in a world that often tried to tell her where she belonged. She belonged here, not because history or tradition or someone else's narrative had granted her a place, but because she had claimed it, protected it, and ultimately shared it with a community built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy and control. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Emily knew that some treasures couldn't be measured by historical significance or monetary value. The most precious things we own are valued simply because they are ours. Our stories, our spaces, our boundaries, our connections. And no one, no matter how entitled they believe themselves to be, has the right to take them from us. In the quiet aftermath of the garden party, as Emily washed glasses and put away leftover food, she found herself drawn to the window that overlooked the Bennett house next door. The new family had left their porch light on, a warm glow in the darkness that seemed to symbolize the change that had come to Oak Ridge. Light replacing shadow, openness replacing secrecy, genuine community replacing enforced tradition. She touched her grandmother's ring, feeling its familiar weight on her finger. The battle for her boundaries, for her right to define her own place in the world, had been won not through dramatic confrontation, but through patience, documentation, and the quiet strength of a community finally willing to stand together. It reminded her of something Beatrice had told her years ago, when Emily was struggling with a particularly difficult boss at her first corporate job. Some battles are won loudly, her grandmother had said, dark eyes wise in her weathered face. But the most important ones, the ones that change things permanently, are won quietly, day by day, through persistence and principle. Emily smiled at the memory. Beatrice would have approved of how she had handled Marcus Bennett, not with anger or public humiliation, but with methodical determination and strategic alliances. The doorbell rang, startling Emily from her reflections. It was nearly midnight, too late for casual visitors. She approached cautiously, peering through the peephole to see Alexander Bennett standing on her porch, his expression somber in the soft porch light. "I'm sorry for the late hour," he said when she opened the door. "I wanted to give you this before I leave town tomorrow." He held out a small velvet box. When Emily hesitated, he added quickly, "It's not from my father. It's from me." Curious, Emily accepted the box and opened it. Inside was a delicate silver pin in the shape of a peony blossom, the craftsmanship exquisite in its detail. "It belonged to Eleanor Simmons," Alexander explained. "My father took it from her dressing table during the estate sale after Leonard died. I found it among his things when I was packing up the house." His expression was a complex mixture of shame and resolution. "I wanted to make sure it was returned to where it belongs. This house, with someone who appreciates Eleanor's garden." Emily was touched by the gesture. Not just the return of the pin, but the acknowledgement it represented. "Thank you," she said simply. Alexander nodded. "The new owners move in next week. They seem like a good family. 3 kids, a dog, the kind of life that house needs after being a mausoleum to the past for so long." "What about your father?" Emily asked. "He's settled into the memory care facility. Some days are better than others." Alexander looked down at his shoes, then back at Emily with unexpected directness. "I wanted to thank you, actually. What you did, exposing his behavior, it forced us all to finally confront what was happening to him. If you hadn't, who knows how much worse it might have gotten before someone intervened." Emily wasn't sure how to respond to gratitude for an action she had taken to protect herself, not to help Marcus. But she recognized the sincerity in Alexander's words. "I hope he finds peace," she said finally, meaning it. After Alexander left, Emily examined the silver peony pin more closely. It was beautiful, artistic rather than ostentatious, with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of personal meaning rather than mere monetary value. The kind of piece that should be worn and appreciated, not locked in a display case as a historical artifact. She placed it on her mantle next to a framed photograph of her grandmother, 2 women from different eras and backgrounds, both connected to this house now, both part of its ongoing story. Emily thought about the complex interweaving of lives that creates a community. How Marcus's obsessive need to control Oak Ridge's narrative had actually ended up liberating it, allowing for a richer, more inclusive history to emerge. How her own determination to protect her grandmother's ring had led to unexpected connections with neighbors who had become friends. How boundaries, properly maintained, could actually create the conditions for genuine belonging. The next morning, Emily woke early and went out to tend the peonies. As she carefully deadheaded the spent blossoms to encourage new growth, she noticed a small green shoot emerging beside the established plants. A new peony, growing from the roots of the old. Eleanor's peonies, becoming Emily's. The past nourishing the present protecting the future. She touched her grandmother's ring, the sapphire warm in the morning sun. Some treasures are measured not by their historical significance or monetary value, but by the connections they represent, to our past, to ourselves, to the people and places we choose to make our own. And those are the treasures worth fighting for, patiently and persistently, until they are securely, unquestionably ours. Have you ever had to stand your ground against someone who felt entitled to what was rightfully yours? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of everyday courage and quiet victories. Sometimes the most powerful response to entitlement isn't dramatic confrontation. It's methodical documentation and finding your true community of support. Hit that like button if you've ever had to protect a personal treasure from someone who thought they deserved it more than you did.